Why am I not hearing Robot Lady?
We have a Robot Lady on our side.
Did anybody else hear the recording get started?
You did.
Yeah, I heard Robot Lady.
That's not a good sign. Can somebody get on the mic and say something for me?
Something for you.
Can you hear me?
Bad sign. I cannot hear people, so I'm going to blissfully do my preamble and then attempt to fix my AV problems afterwards. So fix it in post. Could possibly go wrong. Hello. Into the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. My name is Richard Brown. Today, for at least the next week, I am the only governance facilitator or interim governance facilitator. Hopefully that will change. We can talk about that a bit more once we get into the MIP section of the call. We have, excuse me, we have some, I'll get that in post too. We have some themes that are arising in the ecosystem. Well, more than we can possibly track. One of those themes is obviously cognitive overhead and the amount of work that we need to, or the amount of threads that we need to keep organized in these calls and in the governance ecosystem in general. But the thread that I want to talk about today is whether algorithms will save us or not, and whether humans are a good thing or a bad thing. It is my contention, and I believe probably the contention of the group, that enormously complex systems still require humans. We're not at this glorious future yet where a Python script can replace all of us. Hopefully that day is coming, but it's not here yet. So we have to maintain two tracks in this ecosystem, or this governance ecosystem. One of them is code, and one of them is a social layer. And in that social layer is where things get tricky, at least from my perspective, because we need to start dealing with things like interesting things like reputation and identity and consensus and debate and all kinds of really murky but endlessly fascinating topics that need to be explored in order to have large groups of disparate individuals align on a mission and execute on that mission. That's complicated. That's one of the reasons why we have these calls. There's hard benefits of these calls, information sharing, just broadcasting of general topics and trends, but there's also a cultural component. There's a social aspect at work here where we all align on an identity, and we come to conclusions about our norms and our expectations. These things are all very, very complicated. They happen generally organically, but that doesn't mean that they can't be helped along. And so there we go. That's my segue into talking about today's agenda. We have a team from SourceCred here, and SourceCred is going to talk about a project that helps, in my mind at least, align the complexities of the social layer with incentivizing activities that are good for the protocol, and vice versa, having the protocol enter into a beneficial symbiotic relationship with the social layer. And I'll let them talk about some of those mechanisms. They're going to be, hopefully it spawns off a really interesting discussion. Later on in the call, we'll have a section dedicated to MIPs, which we will increasingly devote more and more time to, and arrive at some more cultural norms about how that section looks and the way that we talk in those sections, and how points of order are being addressed and raised, and what kind of speeches, and whether I need to get a big white powdered wig to wear or not. But in that MIP section, we're going to be talking, or we'll have another presentation from Will Barnes, who I'd like to publicly compliment and give some more kudos for picking up an issue that's critically important to our infrastructure, but and driving it forward. And that is the GSM delay and the dark fix project initiative, call it what you will. And this, let me tie it back to my original thread. So the GSM delay is a technical protocol problem that's solvable and solved. The complexities, at least in my mind here, is that there's a social layer, a significant social layer involved. We need to get into some other murky topics like trust and reputation and identity, and how does that interact with the dark spell mechanisms. And so I'm looking forward to that presentation by Will. Charles will give us his weekly MIPS update to help us begin to understand the MIPS process as we continue to dig deeper, ever deeper into that world. Sorry, I got distracted, too many windows. So I'm going to leave it there. We are tight for time today, so I'm going to hand it off to LongForWisdom. You can give us governance at a glance, and then after that, we'll talk to SourceCred and hear our presentation. All right, Long, it's up to you. I have no idea. You might be talking to me right now. You might not be, but I'm going to hand it off to you, and then I'm going to try and fix my AV problems.
Okay. Can everyone else hear me? Slightly paranoid
Yeah.
about AV problems.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right, I'll do governance at a glance quickly. Cool. All right, so active discussions last week. It's been a little bit quiet last week. There's been a discussion thread opened up by Blake Tots, in which he proposed lowering the ETH liquidation penalty in the, with the aim of restoring the DIPEG that way by hoping like to prompt new diamonds. And that thread saw a fair bit of discussion, which I thought was pretty positive. We had Andy, so in the last call, we discussed hashing on-chain, hashing the MIPS that went into the executive. Andy created a thread where he sort of summarized the benefits of that process. We saw a little discussion. And then the other thing I think I've got in it, hasn't seen a whole bunch of discussion yet, which is the SourceCred trial summary that I posted. I would recommend to people that you read over that maybe after watching the SourceFed presentation to get an idea of what's going to happen or what might happen. In general, just share any concerns or questions you have in that thread. In terms of seeking consensus, I think the only signal request active, which actually just finished, is the change stability fee structure, which I believe the online poll has just finished. How it ended.
Yeah, I remember that. So yeah, the results are in. The poll passed. The negative base rate variant being the first choice. So starting next week, we're going to replace all the weekly stability votes with a single base rate vote. So hooray, less weekly votes. And so we now split the fees into a base rate plus premium setup. So yeah, yay.
Awesome, thanks. So it's one of those things as well. This was the first test of the ranked on-chain polling. Does anyone have any like comments just about that in general? Like, does anyone think it went super well or was confusing or like just have any input?
We need to do it for more things, especially the rates. I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in there super quickly. So there might have been some confusion in the ecosystem about the rank choice and its default application. It was my understanding that it was a new tool in our toolbox. It wasn't going to be retroactive, or not retroactive, like applied to all new votes going forward. It seems other people had some had a different understanding. So I went back and I read through all of the posts, and I didn't see anything about by default adding it to the monetary policy votes. It's certainly on the table though, and I'd be interested in exploring that option. So if somebody from the ecosystem wants that to happen, you know the routine. It's time for a forum post and a poll, and then we can easily get those things happening on the monetary policy votes as well. Seems like a good fit. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'd like sort of echo that. I think it needs a separate signal request. Cool. I think that was what I was to talk about. Oh wait, there was one other thing. I just wanted to highlight. Charles St. Louis has been doing a weekly MIPS update, and has said he's continuing doing it. So there's now a weekly MIPS update thread in the governance category. So if you're wondering like, what the current status of MIPS are, then like read up there, I guess. I think you're in here, Charles. Do you want to talk about that briefly, or are you good?
Yeah,
I
sure.
think that, actually, hold on a second,
Yeah,
Charles.
covered my bit. Yeah.
Let's
So
try and separate the segments a bit. So
Right. Yeah.
I'm reasonably sure that that's going to be the content of Charles' talk today. So I want to get through governance and community, and then we'll have a MIP section right afterwards.
works
Cool.
for me.
Okay, I'm done then.
All right, cool. Then I guess I'm going to hand the mic over to Dandelion, and then we can have a walkthrough of SourceCred. Can you give us a explain it like we're five intro, and then we can.
Yeah, can you enable screen sharing? Because I have a presentation I'd like to show.
I can. I need to briefly make you a co-host because that's the world we live in. We can't have nice things anymore. All right, you should be able to.
Can you make me co-host too while you're at it?
Cool. So I'm Dandelion. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the project lead for SourceCred. And I'm just going to give a brief presentation kind of talking about what SourceCred is, why it's relevant for Maker, a quick overview of how it works, and then some info on how you can learn more. So at its core, we think that governance is really vital. The work you're doing on these calls is super important to Maker. And Maker will be more robust, more sustainable if you are getting rewarded for it and not just all volunteer labor. Planet X made this nice chart just kind of showing how as the complexity increases, it's increasingly unrealistic to just have like the work of governing it be totally unpaid. The problem here is that it's really hard to measure the value of governance, and to reward something in this age of quantitative tokens and crypto rewards, you really need to be able to measure it. So that's where SourceCred comes in. This is a tool that we've built. It's an open source tool for communities to be able to measure value. And it does so based on a core idea that value is created by networks of contributions. And you can assess the value of any individual contribution by looking at how it's embedded in a contribution graph, or essentially a network of related contributions. And then we flow a quantitative score called Cred based on those relationships between contributions. So to make this really concrete, let's suppose that we have this as our contribution graph. On the left, we've got this kind of like toxic thread. Someone made an angry post and it got a lot of angry replies. And on the right, somebody made a really thoughtful form post. It got some insightful replies. It led to a signal request, which had some good analysis, and then it led to a governance decision. In a kind of naive algorithm, one that's just looking at the amount of activity, we might think that these two threads were of roughly equal value because they had the same amount of activity happening. But what we can say instead is, okay, this governance decision was actually quite valuable, and we're sure about that. And so it's generating a lot of cred, and then that cred is going to flow to things that were connected to the governance decision. And the result is that all of this work gets some amount of cred, and the toxic thread was never connected to anything, so it doesn't get any cred. Now, right now, realizing that would require having a Maker plugin to SourceCred. SourceCred uses a plugin architecture, and so in principle, we could have things like governance decisions, have things like signal requests be first-class entities in the SourceCred graphs. But for now, we haven't built that, so we're just looking at discourse graphs. So discourse is the forum software that's powering forum.makerdao.com. And we've got posts, we've got topics, and they're connected to each other, maybe because posts are replies to posts, maybe because posts are contained by topics, or maybe because posts are referencing other posts. And for SourceCred to work, we kind of need to have something to flow cred from. So what we're doing experimentally is we're saying, okay, let's have cred flow from likes. Because the idea is that if somebody in the community liked something, then that's a demonstration that it was seen as valuable by someone. So we can make cred start at all of the like events and then flow again through the graph, where now in this case, like, since this post was liked, the people who wrote things that it replied to got cred, the things that wrote the topic that contained it got cred, and since it was referencing other posts and other topics, those also get cred. And this is something we can do today, and we can run it on the Maker forums. And here's as an example, what are the top topics? And we've spent some time kind of cross-validating this with the Maker team and getting the sense that it is picking up generally like valuable work that's happening on the forums. And then similarly, we can now derive the user scores, where a user gets a lot of cred if they were connected to either by authoring or being referenced by high value posts and discussions. One thing to note is that this is really a community controlled algorithm that's sensitive to parameter choices. So this is what the UI looks like in terms of weight settings. And you can see that we've kind of made likes be the source where we mint cred. Whoops, go back. And then there's just lots of configuration around how much cred flows from something to its references, how much flows from things into its posts. And so we a couple months ago, Seth Benton came on the forums and kind of posted the initial cred distribution based on the forums, and it kind of started off this discussion about experimenting and using this as a way to compensate everyone who's working on Maker governance. And so after talking to the foundation, we have come up with this proposed trial. It's a 3-month scoped trial, so it's explicitly kind of a fixed duration, so that if things go wrong, it doesn't like cause any permanent or lasting damage. And we'll do weekly payouts of DAI directly to everyone who's participating based on their lifetime cred scores. And this is an algorithm the SourceCred uses for itself, where it basically tries to reward people who've been most underpaid. So if you have a lot of cred and you haven't received a lot of DAI, then it will preferentially kind of pay you DAI first. We're going to do at least 5,000 worth of DAI per month. And we're going to offer redemptions on a monthly basis for everyone who has a non-trivial DAI balance. And Maker will be making all the weights choices. This experiment is pretty similar to what SourceCred is doing for its own project. We've been, for the past 8 months, just paying everyone who participates in SourceCred with our own token called Grain, which is redeemable for dollars. And we've had pretty good results there, where we've distributed about $400,000 worth, and it hasn't led to like tons of gaming or weird behavior. So that kind of gives us some confidence in proposing that you try it. The long-term goal is to make a robust, sustainable, and decentralized solution for paying for Maker governance, so that this protocol can kind of like, so that as the complexity of governance scales, it will be backed by a like compensated, rewarded team and not just volunteers. It can only work with buy-in from y'all. It's a social algorithm. And if people like, the thing that keeps SourceCred robust from gaming is the community wanting it not to be gamed, and using both the tools and the algorithm of changing weights, but also tools on the social level of like finding someone who seems to be gaming and talking to them, being like, hey, we're trying to do governance here. You need to like, you need to stop trying to attack the system, or we will either kick you or change the weights to make it so that you're not going to be successful in attacking it. But it's not a kind of magic black box. It is a tool that you as a community can use for your own empowerment. And probably eventually in the long term, we'd want to make some explicit plugins for Maker so that stuff like Maker governance decisions can be tracked in a first-class way. And then we'd move minting cred away from just discourse likes, which are a little easier to game, and move it on to Maker governance decisions, which should be harder to game. Yeah. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think this presentation is about 10 minutes, so I'm not sure if we have time. And we also have in SourceCred a community call every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. And our next community call on this Tuesday, we'll just like have it wide open for anyone from Maker who wants to come, ask questions, tell us you think it's a terrible idea, and we can try to persuade you otherwise. So you're totally welcome to come by our Discord next Tuesday. And we'll also post the link on the thread on the Maker forum. Yeah. That's my talk.
All right, thanks for that. There's some cognitive overhead there. This is a tremendously compelling initiative, I think, because we have different demographics in this ecosystem, and those, depending on the level of interaction and the classification and the, who knows, a few other criteria, there's various levels of reputation and compensation available to people who engage with our ecosystem. this is very compelling to me. There's a very, very interesting experiment to be had here because we have skin in the game, voting mechanism on the portal, but we've seen time and time again that the Plutarchs take direction from sort of this loose representative democracy that we have operating in the forums. That creates a bit of a free rider problem, which I probably shouldn't have said that out loud, but there we go. That's the world we live in. So how do we address this issue where we have a great deal of very intelligent, very highly engaged stakeholders doing a lot of really interesting work in the forums, and ensure that we don't run into issues around commitment drop-off or burnouts. We make sure that people are adequately compensated, or at least begin to understand what adequate compensation looks like. How do we reward people for their efforts? How do we disincentivize people for negative behaviors? These are all ancient, capital H hard problems in the space, well, on the internet in general and in human history, I suppose. I'm sure we'll figure it out now because we have crypto and engineers at our disposal. So the idea is that do something good, push the protocol forward, improve the quality of the conversation, boost the culture, add to things as opposed to taking away from them. And the community and the protocol will attempt to reach an altruistic state where people are rewarded for those activities. This is obviously an enormously complex and sophisticated thing with far-reaching implications and all kinds of stuff, but you have to start somewhere, and I think the SourceCred is a great opportunity for us to play with this. I encourage everybody to hit up the trial details thread in the forum and make your voice heard, and we'll see what this looks like. The TLDR is, though, come and do cool, useful stuff in the forums, and 5,000 DAI will be allocated across people that provide value for the first month, and then we'll see how that thing develops. And if it turns out to be a smashing success, then presumably that pot will increase. And if there's really interested game theoretical weaknesses that get exploited, then we can all work together to improve on it, which will be fun as well. And then we can do it again the next month. So thanks, Daniel, for the presentation. It was very interesting. That could have been just me, desperate fear of awkward silences. So if there are questions and people do want to jump on the mic and ask a question, please do.
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Hey, Rich, and hey, Dandelion. Thanks so much. That's a really interesting presentation. It will, I think, probably be better to talk about how exactly one would build a plugin to make signal posts and governance polls first-class citizens in the SourceCred protocol later on down the line. But my sort of main question for you is mostly around these negative feedback loops. So you say, like if somebody's behaving in a way which is contrary to the goals of governance, we should sort of slowly encourage them to maybe shift on. And that's, admittedly in small communities, which you guys have posted about a lot in the forums, that is totally doable. And I agree that it's manageable at this particular stage in the pilot, and it's certainly not something that should slow us down. But I wonder if you have more long-term thoughts on how to actually assign economic impact to negative behavior, such that, it's not just about like a sort of social or emotional, hey, please leave our community alone, but there's actual, tools that can be implemented at larger scales to try and encourage people to either behave according to the principles and goals of the project, or move along in a way that's more than just social distancing.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Something we talked about a fair bit. A lot of the platforms are on GitHub. Actually, you could give someone a thumbs up reaction. You could also give them a thumbs down reaction. So we've talked should the thumbs down reaction flow nega cred? For the time being, we've generally had pretty good success in just focusing on the positive side and letting the negative feedback come on the social or platform moderation level. If we need to, we could add more tools. It'd be pretty easy to implement a kind of cred timeout. Where you could say, okay, as a moderator decision, you could say, okay, this person's being disruptive. So we're going to say for the next 2 weeks, half of your cred just gets recycled back to everyone else rather than going to you as a time scoped kind of penalty. I think that at the end of the day, it's a very flexible system. So it's pretty easy to like build in new behaviors as we need them. We're fortunate to have not needed a ton of innovation on the like punishing bad behavior side yet, because we haven't seen too much of it.
Yeah, that's cool. When you get to version 2, that might be interesting, and I think that's MakerDAO, Cred, and a Naughtybox is a really cool idea. So, thanks.
It's one of the interesting behaviors that I want to see how they develop, because Dandelion can attest to the fact that I had a lot of piercing questions about this when we first had our discussions. I basically just pelted them with a bunch of negative hot takes until they survived and convinced me that it was a really cool idea. But there's interesting things that we as an ecosystem or a community, I keep on collating or creating a connotation between the two, which is a bit hubristic. But as a community, do we want to attempt to shape behavior with an algorithm, or do we want to just simply reward good work with DAI? So that's a wide spectrum. So on one end, we have a social credit system where if you don't toe the party line, you can't buy an airline ticket anymore. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people that are feel a bit better about devoting their free time to writing MIP6s. There's a big spectrum in between those two things. So does the community want to attempt to disincentivize? That's a big decision. Incentivizing is a fun kind of feel good, let's move this thing forward. And barely, I think, clearly defined, but disincentivizing behavior it's a very interesting road to consider. So these are some of the interesting philosophical, ethical, social questions we need to ask ourselves. And the cool thing is that the SourceCred system gives us a path to start asking those questions, which I'm really looking forward to.
Something I just want to highlight since there's a conversation. As part of the sort of trial details, we set it up so that the trial would not proceed unless a forum poll passed with the majority that the community wanted to continue with wants to do the trial, right? Because it's potentially disruptive. So if you do feel strongly about trying SourceCred or feel strongly against it, then please vote in that poll. Thanks.
Which is a wonderfully altruistic caveat or rider that SourceCred brought along with us to the table, is that they gave the ecosystem an escape hatch at the very beginning, which was the first for a grant application in my world. So thank you, Dandelion and Code, for that. Thank you for your presentation as well. That was very interesting. I'm hoping that we'll get a lot of really cool engagement. We're at 34 minutes after the hour, though, and we have a lot to go through. So I think we're going to segue into the MIPS process. And I talked about that at the outset, where MIPS is a new paradigm. It's a new mental model that we're all becoming familiar with, more and more familiar with, myself included. I'm still trying to wrap my head around whether we need separate sections of the call where we all put on our MIPS hats and behave in a MIPy manner, or whether we start spreading that throughout the entire call. I'm not sure yet, but we'll see if we get farther down that road today. Charles, I'm going to hand it off to you to do the weekly MIP update. And after that, I think I will perform my MIP responsibilities for the day, and then we'll hear from Will. If you want to go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So I'm going to try to keep it a little more brief today because the agenda is quite packed. And I just shared the MIPS update that I posted in the forums, I think a couple days ago. But I'd like to go over kind of the current results of the current governance cycle and LongForWisdom's MIP that's been going through, as well as talk about a few other MIPs that have been proposed and that are in request for comment phase. And then introduce Will, which he will talk about the dark fix mechanism MIP. So I'll begin now. The main thing that happened this week was the governance facilitator submitted a governance poll for the core personal onboarding of LongForWisdom to be added as a governance facilitator. This poll passed today at 12 p.m. So on today's call, we'll have to go over the review of the results of this poll and confirm that the outcome of the governance poll is what we all kind of think it should be, and we can then prepare for week 4 of the governance cycle, which introduces the final vote for LongForWisdom's sub-proposal in an executive that would be posted on next Monday. So if the executive vote will be submitted, if the governance facilitator confirms that the yes outcome of the governance poll during week 3's governance meeting. So that is what Rich will be doing as his duties today. A couple information kind of updates about what the executive vote details is that the vote will have an expiration of 4 days, after which it will have no effect. And in general, MIPs and sub-proposals only move to the executive status if the executive vote has passed within that 4-day limit. So if the executive vote fails to pass within that 4-day limit, the MIPs and sub-proposals are changed to the rejected status. However, in the forum, I think Jay Thalman, if I mispronounced that, I'm sorry, asked the question that if this is rejected, can it be reintroduced? Is this LongForWisdom's only shot at getting elected as the governance facilitator? And to answer that question, right now we are following MIP 2. So this is that period of time where we're bootstrapping the setup and implementation of the first governance paradigm. More specifically, this defines 2 main phases. So right now we're in phase 1 when a core governance framework is put in place and a functional collateral onboarding process is ratified. Phase 1 will last 3 months after it has officially been ratified, which was the beginning of this month. And so to answer that question, MIP 2 phase 1 states that if the MIP is rejected, it can indeed be reintroduced to the community for another vote once the issues at hand have been resolved. So it's not his one shot at getting elected. In terms of the detail, actually, I'm just going to cover a couple other MIPs that have been proposed. So in addition to the processes that we did last week and reviewing the inclusion pool, LongForWisdom also introduced 2 other MIPs. So MIP 13, declarations of intent, and MIP 14, protocol die transfer. So both of these MIPs are in the request for comments phase, and there's been a lot of conversations that have been ongoing. I think LongForWisdom is definitely trying to push the conversations forward and trying to get these introduced into the next governance cycle. So if you have the time, definitely check those out. There's been a lot of conversations around the declarations of intent and how it could relate to bounties, if we want to include bounties platform as a part of the MIP or keep it external. So that's the update there. I can share some links to the MIPs specifically after I cover the next little bit, but in terms of the last week of the governance cycle, so next week, as I mentioned, the executive vote will be submitted once the governance facilitator confirms the yes outcome of this week's governance poll. And next Monday, we also have the first community greenlight poll. And so the purpose of this poll is to give direction about what to do next regarding the active MIP 6 applications. In general and in the future, the community greenlight polls will be published on the 4th Monday of the month and will last until the Friday of that month. And the polls will last for 2 weeks each. So I'll also share some more information about the community greenlight process in the chat after this, but it is all defined in MIP 9. And it's basically this process in which MKR token holders can signal their judgment on the value of a potential collateral asset or collateral type before domain teams can spend time thoroughly investigating and working on those requirements to get them added to the protocol. So next Thursday, the governance facilitator will perform the governance cycle review as part of the governance and risk meeting, in which they'll summarize and discuss the past governance cycle with the community. And you can also have the opportunity to discuss the upcoming governance cycle and what proposals will likely be proposed during that formal submission period, as well as any other possible submissions that might want to go in. In other news, so with respect to the transition to the collateral onboarding framework, I do want to again reemphasize that we are still in this transition period from the current collateral onboarding practices that we know in the weekly cycles to the eventual full transition of the MIPS process and the collateral onboarding framework defined in the MIPS. So given that the community greenlight poll results will last 2 weeks, it will conclude around May 28th. And the MIP-12 proposals that would include the domain work for those collateral assets will not be ready for June's governance cycle. So this means that the domain teams will determine which assets they intend to work on and signal their intentions. And they can also begin working on the deliverables for those collateral types over the course of June. And then we'll kind of proceed through the transition process after that and see if it aligns. The last thing with respect to collateral onboarding was that there was a community call yesterday held by Lucas and Leah, where they continue discussion regarding the PC drop application and the CF drop applications, and also other MIP6 applications. So I don't have the video recording for that. Maybe if one of them are in the call, they can share it. I'll also update that later, but it's really nice to see these community calls keep happening, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about the community green light on these calls in the future as well, to not take away too much time from the governance calls. With all that being said, I think now is probably a good time to introduce Will and have him talk a bit about the dark fix mechanism MIP that he just proposed yesterday.
Do we want to have Rich do his
yeah, Rich can do it. I don't want to take away
things. Yeah.
Doom banging the gavels and stuff. So the governance, I just forgot the name of it. So the governance poll review for this week has ended. There was one poll in that roll-up, and that poll was for the ratification of the second governance facilitator. The poll, happily this time around, was unanimous. So it's moving on to an executive vote at the end of the month, beginning on Monday for 4 days, 3 days, 3.5 days, 4 days. I also want to point out that it was unanimous this time, which is nice. So that means that LongForWisdom will not be the most disliked empowered actor in the ecosystem. It's now 100%. So whoever voted 400 Maker against him last week had a change of heart, which is nice to see. The votes will move into an executive, like I said, on Monday for final ratification. I believe that's the end of MIP's order of business. Is that correct, Charles?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. And so let's hand it off to Will, and we can hear about the GSM, the dark fix, and some of that tasty social layer ambiguity that we need to deal with.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Thanks, Charles. Can you give me the ability to share my screen so I can present or someone?
You should be able to do it now.
Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you, Rich, for the intro and the words on trust in the social layer. We are in this very interesting predicament, being 6 months into this deployment, that we have a GSM delay of 12 hours. And we've talked a lot about the GSM delay. It's the GSM delay is the governance security module, which is a period that you must wait after a successful governance vote before that spell could be. Who's Wrapup TV has entered the waiting room for this meeting. Yeah. Anyways, I'll keep going. So we must wait for the entire GSM delay before the spell can be casted and applied to the system. So this introduces a predicament where if we have an actual critical vulnerability, what do we do? Can we actually patch the system? Because the issue is the spell will sit inside, it will be in the pause for the period of the delay, and anyone can introspect it or reverse engineer it, and it's a reasonable expectation that someone would be able to do that. And if the critical vulnerability affects a significant amount of economic damage, then this is unlikely. We would have to just use emergency shutdown. So we want to prevent that, and we also want to be able to keep the system operating as with maximum uptime. So what is a critical vulnerability? It's one that if its exploitation would result in some significant economic damage to the system, it's feasible for an attacker to exploit against the Ethereum mainnet now or in the near future, and the system must be in normal operational mode. It can't be in emergency shutdown, as it's pretty powerless things we could do. We're pretty powerless in terms of things we could do with the spell in that system state. So right now where are we? We have no existing MIP to do this yet. We've discussed it for several months on the forums, and there's been a lot of great ideas proposed and a lot of input from the community. So what we decided to do was to structure it in a MIP. So we put it in a MIP. It's MIP 15, dark spell mechanism, and it's available on the forums now. And the goal of this MIP is to have an initial policy document in place that we can work from, and introduce iterative design and future governance cycles after ratification. And I also wanted to explain that we've discussed the process that we'll do so far with this dark spell, which we'll have to communicate with the community and coordinate a governance vote using this dark spell to apply the fix. But once we have this MIP in place, we can improve upon it. It's the first step in the process. So the important thing that I really like to explain is that as a means to protecting MKR holders and the greater Maker community from a critical vulnerability, we can use this special spell maneuver in lieu of emergency shutdown to apply fixes to the system once you have downtime. Otherwise, you just have to use emergency shutdown, and that entails things we just don't know. We don't know the amount of downtime and what will, like, other reputational damage that comes from that. So this MIP proposes the dark spell that will conceal this bytecode for the full duration of the governance vote and governance security module delay. So this MIP, and I encourage everyone to read it on the forums. It's available as of last night. There's 8 sections. The definitions section, which is very generic. It's most people will be familiar with some of these terms. Would be, say, spell. What is a critical vulnerability? What is the dark spell? And there's a 4th one. Anyways, I can't remember it right now. The dark spell process overview is, this is highlights the stakeholders, which would be the smart contracts domain team, a trusted third party, a governance facilitator, and the Maker community. And then it outlines the process, the process of this MIP, which I'll discuss in, I believe, the next slide. So section 3 is dark spell requirements, which is that this needs to be a critical vulnerability, which was the first slide, which is the 3 criteria. It's quite generic, but we can discuss that. That's the sole requirement right now. Dark spell governance vote. After thinking about this for a while, we decided that a vote on using the dark spell will go on its own independent vote, unbundled from anything else. It's just supposed to be a referendum on this one issue, fixing the critical vulnerability. And section 5 is the policy, which there's more detail there, and that's something that you'll read offline. I'm not going to discuss it right now. It pretty much is it's like a combination of 1 through 4. Lastly, we have 3 more sections, 6, 7, and 8. This MIP introduces this concept of trusted third parties, which is someone in the community trusts and has elected, and the process is very lightweight and bare bones right now. And then 7 is how the community will elect someone or something, project. It could be anything. It could be an independent auditor. And if you remember, initially we discussed 3 options: large MKR holders, independent auditor, or a tester, like attestation firm, or even just like a smart contract security firm. And lastly, 8, the removal process. This is how you remove one of these parties. So I'm going to move through this slide quickly because there's a lot here, and it's just the MIP explains it so much better. But the process we've proposed is the smart contracts domain team will develop and test the dark spell and be confident that it fixes the issue. The domain team will then communicate to the community and trusted third party that has been elected using, and the smart contracts team in this situation, at least in this initial MIP, has a good bit of discretion over the level of detail that will be shared with the community and trusted third party. And step 3 is important, as we need expedited discussion, and we need a sense of urgency here. because there's reasonable expectation that it'll a critical vulnerability discovered and the protocol will propagate across the industry, and we want to move quickly to schedule the vote because we also have to wait for the duration of the delay. So 4 and 5 is once the trusted third party feels comfortable that we're ready to vote, then the trusted third party indicates to the governance facilitator that we need to schedule a vote. Then the vote happens. If it passes successfully, we have to wait for the GSM delay to pass. And then once we're past it, all the changes are applied atomically in one transaction, and there's no downtime, and the system is secure again. And then lastly, step 7, the trusted third party and SC domain team will release a postmortem of the process and rationale for why this dark spell was used in the contents for posterity, and also as precedent and trust building exercise. It's important to document these things. So that's the spell. A lot of people on this call have probably been party to the discussion in the past, but we need to continue discussing this and start, we need to place this in a future governance cycle. So the next steps that I request, please join the discussion in the MIPS channel or in the governance and risk channel in Rocket Chat. And please, if you have any comments, add them on the forums. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that, Will. There's some interesting stuff embedded in here I want to call attention to, because this is the crux of the matter, is that we have to deal with trust, and that's a very tricky thing to deal with in this ecosystem. Ultimately, let's boil this thing down to its absolute brass tacks. That metaphor didn't work, but let's just power ahead. Somebody has discovered that there's something wrong with the protocol that needs to be fixed. In order to fix it, you need to run a tremendous risk, and that risk is to let the ecosystem know what the problem is, and then you're inviting exploit at that problem. So at that point, so the solution is a dark fix where the domain team or the foundation, or maybe even a third party, comes in and says, we have a fix for the protocol. We want the community to say yes or no, vote this thing in, but we can't tell you what it is, because if we tell you what it is, that increases the area of attack for the protocol. So that's a conundrum. How does the ecosystem vote for something that they're not allowed to possess the details of? The question here is, or the solution is that we find something, someone, some organization, or some person or group of individuals that will either possess some or all of the information about that exploit, and then publicly signal that yes, they know and that they agree that this is important and the community should vote this thing through. And therein, that's where the complexities arise. So who gets trusted in this model? How much information are they provided about this thing that they are offering opinions about? How are they, what level of trust does the community feel comfortable with? Do they need to be bonded? Do we need to know what their address is? Do they need to have a corporation behind them, or is reputation enough? Or is this something that the community has to identify a group of empowered actors that assume that responsibility on behalf of the rest of the ecosystem? There's a lot inside there. So I encourage the community to have a look at that MIP and provide some insight, because this is a thorny issue that needs to be dealt with. Right. We probably have lots of questions about that one too, but we should plow ahead, because there's, we still, poor old Vishesh has been standing by for the last couple of calls with graphs to amaze and us, and I haven't given him any time, unfortunately. Cyrus, can I hand it off to Risk now? Do you have anything you'd like to talk about, or should we move straight to Vishesh?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment. This morning, we put in a proposal for a second collateral type for USDC, so USDCB, with different risk parameters than the original type. Post the link there. Oh, it's already there. Yeah, so basically, there's been discussion in the community for the past couple months about having a separate instance of USDC for emergency liquidity, almost like an emergency credit facility that is designed to be there for keepers when they're running low on liquidity. For example, during auctions, when there's a lot of collateral up for sale, of course, keepers can run low on DAI. So this is designed to help alleviate that somewhat. The stability fee is abnormally high. This is kind of to discourage long-term or sustained usage. Give the thread a read, and let's chat about it in the forums and stuff, and we can discuss it next week as well on the call. And I've linked plenty of discussion threads in the post as well.
All right, are you waiting for questions, Cyrus, or you can hand it off to Vishesh?
Actually, I thought my computer froze. No, I'm not waiting for questions. Vishesh, if you're, yeah, you're up.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. Let's start with some of the basics. Screen share is disabled.
Sorry, give me a second.
I like that though, security feature.
We can't have anything nice. All right, you should be able to do it.
Okay. It's a lot of power because I have the ability to stop the recording too. I don't like that. Okay. So just to touch on, total DAI supply is up. So we'll just go to this real quick. So ETH DAI, basically it's been a linearly continuing trend since that sharp decrease in March. The DAI supply has just been rising. So our latest touch point is 104 million, which is very solid. ETH, that was ETH. So USDCA, remember we saw at the beginning of the month a huge jump by about 9 million-ish. That came up a little bit, about 4 million, and then came back down within the last week. That has kind of stayed stagnant with a couple of small decreases since then. WBTC, so obviously this is just an averaged line, so I would just focus on this time frame. What we saw was a 4 million jump yesterday, so that was about 4.4 million. Yeah, 4 million net jump. So we're sitting at about 4.4 million WBTC minted, a DAI minted from WBTC, which I think is a fairly significant amount given that the debt ceiling for WBTC is currently 10 million. So you got about 40% utilization overnight. As far as the impact that this has had on DAI price, so essentially what we saw was, in the longer time scale, DAI was, at that persistent elevated price. ETH had sort of made, at first, a huge jump down, and then it was recovering, and then it sort of continued its rise, and has kind of slowed its rise in the last couple of days. And so what we saw in DAI was essentially after the initial crash, and this is sort of just in the May timeframe. Obviously, there's all the craziness that happened prior, but post March Madness, DAI essentially had touched back down to peg and then had started to come back up. And so there were some potential concerns that like, oh no, is it doing it again? And so just wanted to kind of answer that question. So what we saw was basically as ETH was, quote unquote cheap, we saw no major impact on DAI. So that sort of communicated a degree of uncertainty as to what was going to continue to happen to prices. But ETH price did sort of recover from that. And then we saw very, very light trading activity. So that makes a lot of sense because what you essentially have is a lot of traders that sort of feel they've potentially missed the boat and don't necessarily want to lever up a large amount at that point in time. But so you saw very light trading volumes in that time frame. And then essentially as ETH started to run up again, we saw a bit of an increase in DAI trading volumes and we saw DAI price come down. So that sort of communicates an increased leverage behavior, which corresponds to the fact that in the May 18th timeframe, there was sort of a slight acceleration in the increase of DAI minted. So this was a bit of a levering up move, which obviously generally tends to bring the peg down because DAI is sold for ETH. And so we're sitting, very close to peg in the grand scheme of things. It's, I would say the peg is in a fairly safe position at the moment in that though it's still persistently above $1, it is very, very close to $1 currently, and it had dipped below for a brief time frame, even though the average price had not truly come down. But just if you sort of put things in perspective of how bad things were, I mean, depends on your perspective of what bad is, but a lot of people were concerned, so I'm going to call that bad for the moment. That peg was at a continually elevated price, had come down during the month of May, looked like it was potentially going to go back up, but that was a temporary move that is very easily explained by the fact that ETH did an unfortunate little whiplash there. And so it does appear to kind of be regulating back down. So unfortunately, ETH has been jerking around the DAI price, but in spite of that, DAI does appear to be doing its best to return to peg. In terms of volumes, so we haven't touched on this in a little while, but because the volumes have were pretty crazy for a while there. What we saw was in the last 7 days, only 28 million DAI traded for ETH, which is in the global timescale of the history of DAI, that's a very solid amount. But in terms of the last couple of months, not that much trading. What we saw was the lower end of that was actually on Coinbase, and the higher end was the bulk on DYDX, and then a little bit on Uniswap, and a little bit on Oasis. So for a time there, when a lot of the crash was happening in March, what we saw was that a portion of the trading volume had been reclaimed by Oasis, but since then it's reverted back to a bulk being DYDX. So most of the DAI ETH trading happens on DYDX, and then actually a fairly decent amount on Coinbase, and those are actually at the lower end of the price range. As far as collateral, so this is your WBTC collateral pool. Basically, it's kind of all or nothing right now. So in terms of liquidations, sorry, reload this. That'll take a second. Yeah, but if you look, the amount of WBTC locked, there's, 1.1 thousand WBTC locked in collateral. So proportionately, that's pretty well protected in terms of the amount of collateral for the amount of DAI value. I'll show you that in just a moment if this loads. Sorry, I had to slow the site down because so many people were accessing it. So yeah, comparatively, like that's a 200 to 250% collateral ratio and a huge kind of clustering there. So that's a pretty decent, like in terms of the risk of insolvency, that's a pretty decent buffer there. So this is kind of like an all or nothing wall here, where at a price of like 6,000, you would see a tremendous amount of liquidation. So it's pretty safe at the moment in terms of collateral values. But again, there's different risks with, a wrapped asset like WBTC to consider, where, it's likely that BTC is not going to make huge percentage moves. But in the event that something does happen with the WBTC peg, given that the oracle for WBTC is currently operating off of a BTC price, it wouldn't be that price movement risk that would necessarily be the biggest thing here. It would be if there was something more fundamentally technologically or liquidity wise that went wrong with WBTC in terms of like what's the risk, right? So that's usually why we look at these collateralization ratios, is because we're considering what's the risk. And traditionally for an asset like ETH, what's the risk has been primarily market risk. But as we sort of diversify to different kinds of assets, you're also diversifying the types of risk that you're exposed to. So the ETH collateral pool is, I'll go back to that. The ETH collateral pool is pretty well collateralized compared to usual. There's a much smaller bucket of percentage of the collateral in the 150 to 200% collateral ratio. A pretty decent amount in the 200 to 250%. This is a bit larger than normal. But there's also larger than normal proportions in the 500 plus percentage and 300 to 350 plus percentage. So that that ETH collateral pool is actually kind of striated. So there's like these multiple gradual walls. In the past, I think we've seen like each of these individual walls being much larger. So it's kind of smoothed out its collateral profile, collateral ratio profile since like March, which I think is a better structure economically for the collateral pool, because gradual liquidations actually tend to help the system maintain its health, whereas large walls of liquidation are big risks. Now, speaking of large walls of liquidation, so USDC, again, this is a pretty stagnant collateral pool. Again, and you also saw that the DAI supply minted from it is also pretty stagnant with a very slight decrease. So this one's a pretty binary risk scenario where if something goes horribly wrong with USDC as a redemption system, then yes, you have the potential to see, 7 to 10 million in liquidation overnight. But again, most people consider that to be a very outside risk. So like I said, the basic takeaway in terms of collateral is, we can talk about BAT for a second if you want, but the basic takeaway for collateral is that there's been a diversification of types of risk that the system is exposed to, though that's not necessarily a decrease in the total amount of risk that the system is exposed to. BAT is sitting at a pretty high collateral ratio overall, and a very small supply overall. The total DAI from BAT is less than 1 million, which has kind of been steady state for BAT. Yeah, I think that's the important bits. Happy to double click on anything that anyone wants to. How do I give access back to you, Long4Wisdom, or can you just take it from me?
Did you
Rich can revoke
just
it, yeah.
mistake me for Long4Wisdom? Are we interchangeable now? Is that what's going on?
Well, I thought Long4Wisdom gave me
And
access.
the new and improved version.
Yeah, not for long. So tell me that in 6 months. All right, I'm taking away your co-host, Vishesh.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any questions? We had a lot to go over in the call. We had Darkfix, we had SourceCred, we have Vishesh's presentation. Any questions that weren't addressed in the sidebar? If you want to jump on the mic, that would be a great time to do.
I just want to say what a great job you did, Vishesh. And just I want to encourage everyone to try to run an auction keeper as we go, and the number of DAI supply keeps on increasing because I think we've turned the ship around. We do have big downturns. It's nice to have other people running other auction keepers to help out when liquidations do occur. I just wanted to make that announcement for everyone. If anyone needs any help running an auction keeper, please feel free to reach out to me, JoeQ at MakerDAO. Thanks.
Cool, thanks for that, Joe. We don't hear from you enough. Any other questions, topics, concerns?
I just want to put out a reminder too that next week, I think TUSD will be going up for a governance poll. We put out a proposal for that a few weeks back. So TUSD and USDCB will both have governance polls next week, and that will be set up for next Friday's executive vote. So if anybody has any questions about TUSD or USDCB, also feel free to ping me on chat or ask here if you want.
Has there been a discussion about kind of consolidating the debt ceiling for USDC and TUSD if it's added?
No, I don't think we've had that discussion yet, but at the very least, my idea was to bring that. I was going to bring it up next week, or actually the week after, once we're confirmed that these two get added in.
It's been mentioned before, I think, in a couple of threads, but yeah, I don't think we've come to any conclusions on it.
Exactly.
I think it's worth thinking about it because I would imagine that most people's concern about TUSD would be similar to concerns about USDC, which is that, how much of the collateral pool do we really want to sit with custodial IOU USD stablecoins. So I think that if there was like a clear path by which the total we would be mainly discussing what the total debt ceiling for them combined is, as opposed to just kind of letting them creep in and increase the total debt ceiling to those collateral types every time. I think that would be kind of quite reassuring.
I mean, is this question really limited to stablecoins, right? I mean, I think we're going to have to tackle this for any off-chain asset that comes on down the pipeline. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts or ideas on the broader strategy of off-chain assets and how to manage those counterparty risks?
Well, I think I agree with you. However, I think that to most people, USDC and TrueUSD is kind of the same thing. Like, unless you happen to think that there's something horribly wrong with one of them, then your objections about letting the debt ceiling get too high for one would equally hold for the other. And I think we can all agree that unless there's something horribly wrong with one of them, which I don't think there is, then it's better to basically think of what is the total debt ceiling that we want to allocate to that very specific kind of asset. So they're all, the things that they have in common is that they're, IOU based, US company issued, US dollar stablecoin, basically very, very similar. So I think that it, for example, when discussing adding TrueUSD, it might make sense to say, let's have a poll about what is the total debt ceiling that should be allocated to, I'm not going to say this long phrase again, but the U.S. company issued IOU-based USD stablecoins. What is the total debt ceiling that should be allocated to those? And then we can come to consensus on that. And then I think it'll just be much easier to keep adding them while splitting that debt ceiling instead of growing it. Because I'm sure that people are going to start complaining that that we're just kind of trying to sneak in lots of this USD collateral slowly, and if each time we're adding a new one, we're actually increasing the debt ceiling, then it really does seem that way. Well, really, in my opinion, what we're trying to do, which is we're just trying to split up this kind of fixed allowance that we have towards these collateral types into more, legitimate options in order to diversify away some of the counterparty risk. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep. Makes perfect sense to me.
I think it would be a shame, basically, if the TrueUSD proposal got resistance based on the fact that people simply don't want to grow the debt ceiling to those kinds of assets above 20 million, as opposed to being stopped because they didn't like something specifically about TrueUSD. And I think it's important that we don't end up talking past each other in that debate.
Oh, sorry, just a comment. So in terms of the consistency on the, oh, fuck. Yo, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, so in terms of the consistency, just like from like the fiat side of things, I think it makes total sense in terms of obviously like, mitigating the risk and stuff, but having like a really clear definition of the risk per se. So taking USDC and TrueUSD, there's actually like on face value, they look the same, but they're actually kind of different because the composition of assets that, let's say the banking partner that TrueUSD works with versus USDC, the custody solution that USDC would typically operate under, like the security model on their end. And then you've got things like, so the consistency, is everyone using Silvergate Bank, or are one company using Silvergate and one company is using Signet? USDC specifically, they're in treasury bills. So even if like they're not in a money market account, as where TrueUSD might actually be sitting in a money market account, and the like licensed custodian, registered money services business and stuff like that. I think that's probably a pretty sizable consideration. I'd put TrueUSD specifically as the outlier against the others, and probably carries the most risk and the least reward out of Pax, Huobi, GUSD, all that sort of stuff for consideration.
That raises an interesting point, though, about how far down the rabbit hole are we able to go when determining risk for the stablecoins, right? Like, does the level of audits for each one of these collateral types involve us having a clear understanding of their banking relationships as well as like the regulatory risks? And it seems like a big lift. Cyrus, like, is that something that your team is considering? Like, how, or is there a tranche for stablecoins, and that's just like simply this is the debt ceiling the combined debt ceiling. This is the level of risk for these three buckets of stablecoins.
I mean, you're correct in that it's certainly a big lift to go in and analyze banking relationships for all the stablecoins, and really getting that deep insight under the hood. We definitely mentioned that in our analysis a few times, but yeah, I mean, we definitely, Mike, if you or anyone else has some deep insight into, I guess, the counterparty risk under the hood, please, we'd love to hear from it and hear your thoughts on how that might affect the risk parameters that are currently in play.
Yeah, and I definitely think, like, I pretty much agree with everything. I just think that anything like from our side, that if there's anything I can share to help just everyone sort of like understand what potentially could go wrong. Total dark horse, like, black swan stuff, really unlikely, but I think it's just really good to share, because all of this stuff just doesn't come unless you're in the weeds, banging your head against the wall every day, basically. So, which is what I'm doing. So, yeah, I'm happy to share any stuff. I think, yeah, probably the biggest thing is just like, I'm trying to explain it. Treasury bill, like being backed by like treasury bills versus having money in an overnight money market account is sort of different. And I think like why I put a lot of thought to it personally is because it's going to end up being the bridge between CeFi and DeFi. And right now, you kind of want to have this, the reason why you really want to get it right with the stablecoin stuff is because effectively, whatever this stablecoin is, so we talked about a composition of like debt ceiling or risk out of the whole pie that's willing to be allocated to these fiat-backed assets, or let's say real-world assets, and in specifically these fiat tokens. They're going to basically be what, you know, the DSR is, but for centralized assets. So if you're holding a lot of these, you know, in an ideal world, you're holding a lot of these assets and you're representing them as one token, because now MakerDAO and the whole community can actually be earning on the CeFi space as well as, you know, any opportunities in the DeFi space. I think I might have just actually gone a bit out of the conversation there, but yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity basically in this stuff.
Mike, yeah, thank you for that. I think this is exactly the kind of you know, our argument that would be relevant to the, you know, to the specific TUSD part of the process. While, you know, if someone's objection was about the total debt ceiling that we had allocated to USD stablecoins, then obviously this discussion should live somewhere else. So this is exactly why I think it would be useful to separate those two. But as another question, is it public information which money market funds TrueUSD holds their cash in?
I mean, I don't work at TrueUSD now. I feel really bad, but I think that's sort of a given. I don't know specifically, and if I did, I probably would feel very bad saying it because it's just not my place to say that. And I think that's what everybody does, but I just know that specifically they're a risk team as well, right? And on the back, you know, on their back, they're like the backside of their whole like operation. Everyone's got different compositions. Some people have, you know, got it sitting in a bank account with Silvergate earning 5 bips a year. Other people have got it more creatively being allocated. And so, yeah, the answer is no, I don't know. Sorry.
Because I actually do think that should be part of our, we should know that kind of thing as part of our risk process. So the fact that didn't come up, or that we weren't able to determine this, I think is not not ideal.
They're a great team, by the way. In case it feels like I was not supportive, I'm very supportive. I just wanted to sort of like help share some thoughts.
So I wanted to bring up one other consideration. I agree with Ev's mental model on how to think about the overall debt ceiling for these. Do we want that to apply to our emergency liquidity facility for USDCB is the question. There's obviously a certain amount of risk there. That facility is likely to not have many assets under custody most of the time. And then also it's worth mentioning that that facility is likely to be used and have its debt ceiling adjusted in a black swan event. So if we end up in a liquidity crunch again, we're likely to have to tap that facility even harder. So I don't know, just something worth thinking about in the forums when we discuss it. The only other thing that I think is worth thinking about is whether or not we turn liquidations on for these. Liquidations are not on for these class of custodied assets, and that breaks some stability fee incentivization. I think there's arguments for and against it, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have.
So this actually reminds me of an important point, I think, which is that this USDCB style of emergency collateral for DAI liquidity injections. I think actually it's even more important to diversify that one across issuers potentially, because just an interesting example was specifically USDC, and specifically on Black Thursday, when of course USDC didn't exist as a collateral type literally on Black Thursday yet. It was introduced the week after. On Black Thursday, it was impossible to get USDC out of Coinbase for if I remember correctly, a couple of hours, because Coinbase was having trouble with keeping up with the high gas prices. They ended up resolving this issue, but basically they weren't adjusting their gas prices up, I think. So this meant that, actually this could have, under similar circumstances, this emergency USDCB thing could have failed, where maybe you managed to scrape together $1 million or 2 million USDC from what was available on DEXs, but once you tried to withdraw it from the main exchange where people hold USDC, you wouldn't have been able to do it in time. And that's exactly the kind of situation where if you could go to TrueUSD instead, or one of the other stablecoins that have been mentioned, you might have been able to get that emergency liquidity. So actually, this is one where we should not neglect to, think about TrueUSDB, and likewise for all of the other ones that we talk about adding.
Any thoughts on liquidations for these from anybody?
I'm just going to come out and say that I'm in favor of liquidations, because it's kind of a fundamental part of the social contract that if you become under collateralized due to fees, you get liquidated. So I think right now the overall theme is that we're not going to do it to start with, but I'm just going to come out on the other side of that.
So Mane just asked an interesting question in the sidebar. Mane, do you have a mic? Do you want to ask it, or shall I? Okay, no. So he was asking, is it possible to have a different initial margin versus maintenance margin? So I guess different collateralization ratios, like an initial ratio and then like a liquidation ratio. I think the answer is no, but I just want to clarify.
Yeah, if it's for one collateral type, there's not the ability to do that. If I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, just so like if you open it, so say you have one, like the open at 150% and then the liquidation at 125%, then you would be able to open 150 and you wouldn't get liquidated until you're under 125.
Yeah, the only thing you can do is like encourage front ends to discourage users from
sure.
starting with the collateral ratios too.
I'll say it's something that has to be addressed at some point, because if you just let these stable coin denominated vaults continue to accrue fees, eventually you get not only under the collateralization ratio, but you actually become underwater completely, and now the backing of DAI is so some percentage of the DAI supply is not backed, would be the way to say it. And you can't allow that to happen from a protocol risk perspective, right? There's something that's building up there that would blow up. So we have to figure out a policy for when and how to enable liquidations on these things eventually, no matter what.
terms of like oracles, and like I think the reason we didn't launch them was because the oracle was like fixed to $1, right? Because it was easier. So I guess what do we need to turn on liquidations? Do we need like oracles against like DAI USDC and DAI TUSD oracles?
I think we can do it right now, but the big concern about just flipping that switch is that a lot of the existing USDCA holders have kind of let their current vaults go over the 125% or whatever that we're at. So if we do flip that switch, there will be a whole wall of liquidations, and I think we saw it on Vishesh's chart, where we'll be auctioning off a lot of USDC, and that'll hurt some feelings, and it's not what we really want for the protocol. I mean, one thing we could do is drop the collateralization ratio requirement at the same time that we turn on liquidations, and that would prevent that wall. But we would also need to be very clear to people that we are doing that, and that they need to at least pay down some of their vaults so that they're within a safe ratio.
Yeah, and yeah, so just to generalize a little bit, generally the biggest concern I've heard expressed with liquidating these things is that it's likely that, you know, liquidations would be highly correlated, so that, you know, because all these, you know, stablecoin vaults are generally being used to do the same sort of thing, usually in the same sort of time frame, you know, making the same sort of trades, either shorting DAI or generating emergency liquidity. And so then the concern is that if they all hit liquidation around the same time, you have a very, you know, large amount of DAI going to liquidate, you know, or sorry, a very large amount of debt going to auction at the same time. And then that can, as we know, cause its own crisis. So you might not fully recapitalize the way you should. And now you have like the thing that's supposed to solve a liquidity crunch causing the liquidity crunch. And of course, in this case, we have this like special extra consideration of that we've had liquidations off, and, you know, people sort of took positions based on liquidations being off, and now we have to ask, you know, how should we unwind that?
Yeah, and DAI has dropped below $1 on a couple occasions in the last week or two here, and so ideally, in an ideal world, the people who do have USDC positions would be setting limit orders somewhere at Oasis or wherever to pick up those large sales and clear out. And that may be a reason why we're not seeing DAI drop below $1 for any significant amount of time. But we also can't really enforce that either. It just it's whenever they want. There's no closed end on any of these.
Right, well, I think I'm going to jump into the awkward silence. We're an hour and a half in. That's pretty close to the end of, or past the end of the Q&A session. So I am going to press stop on the record button. And then unless I see some objections in the sidebar, probably bring the call to a close. I want to thank everybody for their presentations. I want to thank people who asked the questions as well. It's really important that we get the people on the mic into the historical record for the YouTube viewers, which we have a considerable number these days. So thanks everybody for piping up and offering your expertise. Mike from Wire, I think that you played yourself. We're going to be hitting you up for some details about stablecoins as well. So congratulations. All right, thanks everybody for joining us. See you next week.